Benghazi, Libya, August 1, 1943. The temperature on the desert strip is already climbing past 90 degrees Fahrenheit. 178 B-24 Liberators sit nose to tail across 5 airfields carved out of the sand. Their crews have spent 6 weeks rehearsing a single mission. Some have written letters home, sealed, marked for delivery only if they fail to return. Their target is 2,000 miles away, a city in Romania most of them cannot pronounce. 9 refineries that supply roughly a third of the fuel that runs the German war machine. They are flying in daylight. They are flying without fighter escort. They are flying at 50 feet above the ground. Brigadier General Uzal Ent climbs aboard the lead aircraft. He has told his staff what he believes in private. If nobody comes back, the results will be worth the cost. Within 8 hours, 53 of the bombers will be gone. 310 of the airmen will be dead. The mission will be called a strategic success in Washington. The official record will, in time, find a different verdict. This is the story of Operation Tidal Wave. 43,000 American airmen were killed in the skies over Europe and the Pacific. They didn't die because of the planes. They died, and they won, because of the men on the ground who decided how to use them. This is Eagle Command. The standard account of Operation Tidal Wave reads like a script written for valor. 5 medals of honor in a single afternoon, the most ever awarded for one air action in the history of the United States military. A record that, in 2026, still stands. That is true. It is also incomplete. The 5 medals were awarded because the mission asked the impossible of the men who flew it. That impossibility was not an accident of weather or a failure of nerve. It was a decision made in Washington in May of 1943. A decision endorsed by Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill. A decision that sent 178 heavy bombers 2,000 miles to attack the most heavily defended target in occupied Europe at chimney height, in daylight, without fighter cover. The Liberators executed what the planners chose. The story of Tidal Wave is not the story of the airplanes. It is the story of the document those airplanes were flying inside, a document drafted in a Washington office building over the course of 3 weeks, a document that defined what success would look like and what the cost was permitted to be. The men in the room knew the math. They sent the bombers anyway. To understand why 178 Liberators were sent against Ploiesti, you have to start with a single number. Roughly 1/3, that is the proportion of Axis liquid fuel that came out of one city on the Romanian plain. Some wartime estimates placed Germany's crude oil dependence on Ploiesti as high as 60% at peak. The Luftwaffe's aviation gasoline, the high-octane fuel that kept the Messerschmitts and the Focke-Wulfs in the air, came almost entirely from Ploiesti's refineries. The single largest of those refineries, Astra Romana, processed roughly 2 million tons of crude every year. Together, 9 major refineries in and around the city produced something close to 8.5 million tons annually. About 90% of all Romanian oil, bomb Ploiesti, the planners believed, and Germany's war machine would seize. The American interest in Ploiesti was older than the war. The Air War Plans Division of the United States Army Air Forces, working out of the munitions building in Washington in August of 1941, had identified Romanian oil as a strategic priority in the document known as AWP-D1. The plan that would, in time, become the architecture of the entire American strategic bombing campaign. Oil was on the list before Pearl Harbor. The first American attempt to act on that list came on June 12, 1942. 13 B-24, Liberators of Colonel Harry Halverson's detachment, flew from Egypt against Ploiesti. They had originally been bound for China to bomb Tokyo, then were redirected after the Doolittle raid closed the Chinese bases. They hit Ploiesti with negligible damage. The unintended consequence was strategically catastrophic. The raid alerted a Luftwaffe officer named Alfred Gerstenberg, the German general responsible for Romania's air defense. Over the following 13 months, Gerstenberg turned Ploiesti into a fortress. By the summer of 1943, Gerstenberg had assembled what was, by most accounts, the most heavily defended target in Axis Europe outside the Reich itself. The exact count of his anti-aircraft guns varies by source. The figure most often cited is 36 heavy batteries of 88mm and 105mm guns, 16 lighter batteries of 37 and 20mm pieces, and 15 Würzburg fire control radar stations directing their fire. Other sources count the individual guns rather than the batteries, and arrive at well over 288s. Either way, the picture is the same: layered, integrated, modern, lethal. Above the guns were 57 fighters within range. German Messerschmitt 109s at Mizil, Romanian YAR-80s and Messerschmitts at airfields ringing the city, Bulgarian biplane fighters along the egress route, 23 barrage balloons, smoke generators that could choke the valley within 90 seconds of a warning, decoy refineries set deliberately ablaze to draw attacks, a disguised flak train, code-named Die Raupe, the Caterpillar, that ran along the rail line bombers would have to follow toward the refineries. In Washington, in the spring of 1943, the American planners knew most of this. They knew the defenses. They knew the distance from Benghazi to Ploiesti and back, the better part of 2,400 miles. They knew that the bombers would be flying without fighter escort because no Allied fighter in 1943 could make that round trip. They knew it would be daylight, and they knew it would be in summer haze. And they argued, in spite of all of that, for sending the bombers in low. The man who made the case for the low-altitude attack was Colonel Jacob Edward Smart. Smart was a member of General Hap Arnold's advisory council, a small group of hand-picked officers Arnold kept around him to do the work that did not fit the normal staff system. In April of 1943, Arnold gave them a problem. Find a way to destroy Ploiesti. The conventional answer was high-altitude precision bombing. It was the doctrine the Bomber Mafia had spent the 1930s building, the doctrine AWPD one had been written around, the doctrine the 8th Air Force was at that moment attempting to execute over Germany from English bases. A medium-scale, high-altitude raid from Syrian airfields was the option Lieutenant Colonel Cornelius Whitney put on the table. Smart proposed something else. He argued for a single mass attack at low altitude, not 500 feet, not 200 feet, 50 feet, chimney height. The aircraft would come in below German radar coverage, below the angle at which the heavy 88mm guns could depress to fire on them, below the altitude at which fighters could engage from above without breaking off into the ground. The Norden bomb site would be replaced with a simpler, low-level site. Bomb bay fuel tanks would extend the range. The crews would be trained in formation, flying at altitudes they had been ordered, all their flying careers, to avoid. The argument for low altitude rested on 4 claims. Accuracy, which had so far eluded high-altitude doctrine over Europe. Surprise, since German radar would not see the bombers until they were already committed. Reduced fighter exposure, because interceptors could not attack from below. And force economy, because a single decisive strike could do in one morning what a sustained campaign would otherwise require. Arnold approved Smart's plan. The strategic concept moved up the chain. At the Casablanca conference in January, Churchill had already described Ploiesti to Roosevelt in 3 words that would echo through every subsequent planning document: the taproot of German might. According to Smart's own later account, at the moment of decision, Churchill turned to Arnold and said simply, "Get it done." The formal endorsement came at the Trident conference in Washington from May 12 to May 25, 1943. Roosevelt was present. The combined chiefs of staff agreed that representatives of the Army Air Forces should present the Ploiesti plan to the North African theater commander. The plan was first code-named Statesman, then Soapsuds. Churchill personally objected to Soapsuds. He thought the name unbecoming the gravity of the mission, and that the men who would fly it deserved better. The final code name was Tidal Wave. By early June, Eisenhower as theater commander and the combined chiefs gave the operational green light. Roosevelt's signature does not appear on the takeoff order, but every part of Tidal Wave that mattered had been approved at his level by him and Churchill before the bombers were tasked. What happened next is the part of the story that the standard account leaves out. The mission was handed to Major General Louis Brereton, commander of the 9th Air Force in Egypt. Brereton did not propose Tidal Wave. He was told to execute it. In a pre-mission memorandum, he wrote that the destruction of the target would warrant the possible expenditure of the entire force. That phrase is worth reading twice. It is not the language of a commander confident in his plan. It is the language of a commander acknowledging that he has been ordered to spend his bombers, all of them if necessary. Below Brereton, Brigadier General Uzal Ent of the 9th Bomber Command reportedly drafted a letter recommending the mission be flown at high altitude instead. 50% destruction, Ent argued, was the best that could be hoped for on a single low-level attack. Better to bomb from above repeatedly until the target was effectively neutralized. Brereton returned the letter marked disapproved. Colonel John Kane, commanding the 98th Bomb Group, who would fly the mission, reportedly called the plan the work of some idiot armchair warrior in Washington. Major General Ira Eaker, who commanded the 8th Air Force in England, objected to the loan of his 3 B-24 groups, the 44th, the 93rd, and the 389th, on temporary duty to North Africa for the mission. After the raid, he would write Arnold that his ability to keep pressure on the German aircraft industry had been crippled by the loss of those crews at Ploiesti. The plan moved forward over every objection. 5 bomb groups were assembled at Benghazi, Libya, the 376th, the Liberandos, the 93rd known as Ted's Traveling Circus, the 98th Pyramiders under Kane, the 44th Flying 8 Balls under Colonel Leon Johnson, and the newly arrived 389th Sky Scorpions under Colonel Jack Wood, 178 B-24 Liberators. Roughly 1,750 aircrew. For 6 weeks they trained. Full-scale wooden mock-ups of the Ploiesti refinery complex were laid out in the Libyan desert. Crews bombed them again and again until they could fly the approach blindfolded. Norden bomb sites were removed and replaced with low-altitude sites. Auxiliary fuel tanks were installed in the bomb bays, raising fuel capacity past 3,000 gallons. Forward-firing machine guns were bolted to the noses of the lead aircraft so that pilots could strafe ground installations during the run-in. The targets themselves were given codes. White 1 was the Romana Americana refinery. White 2 and White 3 were Concordia Vega and Standard Petrol Block. White 4 was Astra Romana, the largest. White 5 was Columbia Aquila. Blue was Creditul Minier at Brazi. Red was Steaua Romana at Câmpina. Each bomb group was assigned a specific refinery. The plan depended on every group hitting its assigned target in sequence within a narrow window of minutes while the surprise lasted. On the evening of July 31, 1943, with the bombers fueled and the bombs loaded for takeoff before dawn, an order arrived from Washington. Arnold had decided that Brereton, Smart, and the 93rd Bomb Group's founder, Colonel Edward Timberlake, were not permitted to fly the mission. They knew too much about other Allied plans, the Manhattan Project among them. They would have to stay on the ground. Ent would fly as airborne mission commander in the lead aircraft of the 376th, Colonel Keith Compton's Teguian. Lead crews were reshuffled overnight. What the men in the bombers did not know as they checked their watches before dawn was that the Germans were already waiting. The day before, a signal intercept station in Athens had picked up 9th Air Force transmissions out of Benghazi. The Bulgarian Air Force had been alerted. The radar belt across the Balkans was watching the southern Mediterranean. The element of surprise that Smart's plan rested on, the central assumption of the low-altitude approach, was, before the bombers left the runway, already gone. If decisions like this matter to you, the subscribe button keeps the missions coming. The takeoff began before dawn on August 1, 1943. Engines on 5 Libyan airfields turned over in the dark. Bombers fueled to maximum capacity, loaded with 500-pound and 1,000-pound high explosive bombs, plus incendiaries, plus delayed action fuses, set to detonate anywhere from 45 seconds to 6 hours after impact. The bomb bay auxiliary tanks added thousands of pounds of additional weight. The desert strips were short. The air was thick. The first loss came in the first minute. AB-24, named Kickapoo of the 389th Bomb Group, clipped a power pole on takeoff, lost an engine, climbed, stalled, and crashed in flames. 2 of the 10-man crew survived. The mission had not yet reached the Mediterranean. 177 Liberators climbed away from Benghazi toward the Ionian Sea. Over the open water, the second loss. The lead navigator's aircraft of the 376th Bomb Group, a Liberator named Wongo Wongo, flown by Lieutenant Brian Flavel, entered a violent pitch oscillation, rolled inverted, and dove into the sea. The cause was never determined, possibly a runaway autopilot. All aboard killed. With them went the primary navigator for the entire strike force. Flavel's wingman, Lieutenant Guy Iovine, descended to look for survivors. He could not regain altitude with his fuel load and aborted the mission. With him went the secondary navigator. 10 more crews aborted for mechanical reasons. Strict radio silence had been ordered. The order would not be broken to rebuild the formation. The faster 376th and 93rd leading pulled ahead of Kane's 98th, Johnson's 44th, and the 389th as they climbed across the cloud-shrouded Pindus Mountains of Albania. By the time the bombers crossed into Yugoslav airspace, the strike force had separated into 2 distinct elements roughly 20 minutes apart in time. Below, German radar tracked their progress. At Ploiesti, halfway to the target, the formation made the planned checkpoint. The 389th broke northeast as briefed, heading for Câmpina and the Steaua Romana refinery. The other 4 groups continued east toward the next turn point at Târgoviște. At Târgoviște, the third catastrophe. Colonel Keith Compton, leading the 376th, turned southeast along the wrong railway line. The line he was supposed to follow ran from Ploiesti into Ploiesti. The line he turned onto ran toward Bucharest. His navigator, Captain Harold Wickland, a veteran of the Halverson raid the previous year, told him he was wrong. Brigadier General Ent, in the right seat, concurred with Compton. Behind him, the 93rd followed. The bombers were now flying toward the wrong city. Multiple crews broke radio silence to shout the error. Some of them used the open channel. The Germans heard. It was Lieutenant Colonel Addison Baker, commanding the 93rd Bomb Group, who realized the mistake first. Baker broke formation, turned his group north, and headed for the actual target. Compton turned the 376th around late and approached Ploiesti from the south. Directly into the heaviest concentration of 88mm flak Gerstenberg had positioned to defend that approach. The first American bomber lost over Romania was a B-24 of the 376th, named Brewery Wagon. Lieutenant John Palm, the pilot, jettisoned his bombs on an empty factory and was finished by a Messerschmitt over the eastern outskirts of the city. 8 of his 10-man crew were taken prisoner. What followed lasted approximately 27 minutes. Baker, leading the 93rd, took his bomber Hell's Winch into Columbia Aquila and Astra Romana from the wrong direction, against the smoke and against the planned attack axis. An 88mm shell struck Hell's Winch during the run-in. The aircraft caught fire. Baker and his co-pilot, Major John Jerstad, held the lead. They did not break formation. They did not turn for the open fields, suitable for a forced landing. They flew through the flak with their aircraft on fire and dropped their bombs on the target. Then, with the fire spreading, Baker climbed to roughly 300 feet to give the crew a chance to bail out. The Liberator stalled, rolled, and crashed in flames. All 10 men aboard were killed. Jerstad was not assigned to the mission. He had completed his combat tour. He had volunteered to fly Hell's Winch as co-pilot because, in the words of his Medal of Honor citation, he believed his participation would contribute materially to success. He was 26 years old. The 93rd lost 11 aircraft over the target. Behind them, Compton and the 376th attacked targets of opportunity rather than the assigned refineries. A three-plane element under Major Norman Appold maneuvered around the city and hit Concordia Vega effectively. The rest of the 376th missed. The primary target assigned to the group, the Romana Americana refinery, was never struck. Compton, on Ent's authority, radioed Benghazi that the mission was successful. The 98th and the 44th had not yet attacked. When Kane and Johnson arrived 20 minutes behind schedule, the situation was beyond what any briefing had prepared them for. The target area was on fire. The 93rd's bombs were detonating with the delayed fuses, throwing debris higher than the formation's attack altitude. The Germans had been alerted for half an hour. Every gun was tracking. The flak train Die Raupe ran along the rail line the 98th and 44th were supposed to follow into their targets. The smoke from the burning refineries climbed past 3,000 feet. Kane had briefed his crews before the mission with words that survived him. It would take an entire army a year, he said, to fight its way up here and smash this target. We are going to do it in a couple of minutes with less than 2,000 men. He led the 98th in. Bombers cleared smokestacks at 50 feet and below. Aircraft flew through the flames of other aircraft already burning on the ground. The 98th's gunners fired down into the flak train as they passed. A B-24, named Old Baldy, hit in the cockpit, crashed directly into the 86th Battery of the Romanian 7th Anti-Aircraft Regiment at Corletești, killing all 10 Americans aboard and 6 Romanian gunners on the ground. Colonel Leon Johnson, in the co-pilot seat of the 44th Bomb Group's Susie Q, faced the same problem at Columbia Aquila. The target was burning. The defenders were alerted. His own assigned aiming point had been bombed in error by the 93rd. He could have aborted. The doctrine permitted it. He pressed the attack. The 44th lost 11 of 37 bombers over the target. A separate 21 aircraft element of the 44th, under Lieutenant Colonel James Posey, broke off and attacked the Credital Minier refinery at Brasi from very low altitude with 1,000-pound bombs. The Brasi attack was the most successful action of the day. Posey lost no aircraft over the target. Credital Minier did not return to full production for the remainder of the war. At Câmpina, 20 miles north, the 389th attacked Steaua Romana. The plan worked there better than anywhere else. The 389th had taken its own route. It had not been caught up in the Târgoviște error. It had arrived approximately as briefed. The attack proceeded in 3 waves against 3 aiming points within the refinery. Steaua Romana would not produce again at full capacity during the war. The 389th lost 4 aircraft over the target. One of them was Ol Kickapoo, piloted by 2nd Lieutenant Lloyd Hughes, 22 years old, a graduate of Texas Agricultural and Mechanical College, class of 1943. Hughes brought his bomber into the target with fuel streaming in sheets from his bomb bay and his left wing, both hit during the approach. A field suitable for forced landing lay within sight. He held course. He flew his aircraft through the burning refinery, dropped his bomb load precisely on target, then attempted to land in a riverbed beyond the city. The wing struck the ground. The aircraft cartwheeled. Hughes and most of his crew were killed. The retreat from Ploiesti was, in some ways, worse than the attack. Aircraft already damaged faced a 2,000-mile return flight to friendly bases. 5 B-24s were shot down over the Ionian Sea by Messerschmitt 109s of the 27th Fighter Wing returning from the Mediterranean. 2 collided over Yugoslavia. Bulgarian biplane fighters, Avia B-534s, older than some of the American pilots, downed bombers over the Eastern Balkans. 4 Bulgarian pilots scored their nation's first fighter kills of the war that day. A B-24 named Hadley's Harem, piloted by Lieutenant Gilbert Hadley of the 98th Bomb Group, ran out of fuel and ditched off the southern coast of Turkey. Hadley, his co-pilot, and his bombardier were killed in the crash. 7 crewmen swam ashore and were interned by the neutral Turkish government. The cockpit of Hadley's Harem was recovered from the Mediterranean in 1995 and is now displayed in a museum in Istanbul. Kane's own aircraft, Hail Columbia, crash-landed on Cyprus, out of fuel. Of the 177 B-24s that left Benghazi that morning, only 88 returned to North African bases. 23 landed at other Allied bases in Cyprus, Malta, or what is now Syria. The rest, 53 aircraft, were destroyed. 310 airmen were killed or missing. 108 were captured by Axis forces. 78 were interned in neutral Turkey. 4 were sheltered by Yugoslav partisans of Josip Tito's movement. Approximately 130 more were wounded but returned alive. Approximately 500 men of the United States Army Air Forces did not come home from Ploiesti. Roughly 30% of the dispatched force was destroyed. Roughly 30% of the crews became casualties. Operation Tidal Wave was, proportionally, the most costly major Allied air raid of the entire war. The question that has hung over Operation Tidal Wave for 83 years is whether it was worth what it cost. The initial damage assessment, compiled in Washington in the days after the raid, was encouraging. Photographic interpretation suggested that roughly 40% of Ploiesti's refining capacity had been destroyed. 3 refineries, Steaua Romana at Câmpina, Creditul Minier at Brasi, and parts of Columbia Aquila, appeared to be at or near total loss. Air Force Historical Support Division language, written into the official record decades later, would acknowledge that the attack temporarily eliminated about 3,925,000 tons of annual production at Ploiesti, roughly 46%. The word that mattered was temporarily. Within weeks, the Enemy Oil Committee, the inter-allied body that assessed German fuel production, delivered an appraisal in language that should have ended any celebration in Washington. There would be, the committee found, no curtailment of overall product output. The reason was simple, and it was the reason Smart's plan had missed. The refineries at Ploiesti before the raid had not been running at maximum capacity. They had been running at the level of German demand, which was below what the plant could sustain. When the bombs damaged operating capacity, Gerstenberg simply activated the idle capacity that had been sitting in reserve. Thousands of forced laborers were trucked in. Repairs proceeded around the clock. Within weeks, output recovered. By October of 1943, 2 months after the raid, Ploiesti's petroleum exports actually exceeded their pre-tidal wave levels. Astra Romana, Kane's target, was back at full production within months. Concordia Vega was at 100% by mid-September. Only Creditul Minier at Brazi, the target Lieutenant Colonel Posey hit so well, and Steaua Romana at Câmpina, where Hughes died, failed to restart until well into 1944. Gerstenberg's own report to Berlin in the first week of August summed it up. The damage, he wrote, would not appreciably diminish the supply of fuel to Germany and its allies. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, completing its work in 1945 and 1946, with full access to German records, confirmed the verdict. The August 1943 Ploiesti raid had only limited and short-term effects on Romanian production. German fuel deliveries actually increased through early 1944, until a different campaign, fought a different way, finally broke the Ploiesti complex. That campaign began on April 5, 1944. It was flown from new bases at Foggia in southern Italy. It was flown by a different organization, the 15th Air Force, under Major General Nathan Twining, in coordination with General Karl Spatz's strategic targeting priorities. It was flown at high altitude, above 20,000 feet, with P-51 Mustang fighter escort for the round trip. And it was flown not as one mission, but as 24 missions, with over 5,000 heavy bomber sorties between April and August of 1944. The Foggia campaign worked. Ploiesti's monthly production dropped from 186,000 tons in April to 81,000 tons in May. The refineries ceased to function before Soviet ground forces occupied the city on August 30, 1944. The Allies lost roughly 350 aircraft and over 2,800 airmen killed or wounded in that high-altitude campaign. The cost was high. But Ploiesti finally went down. What Tidal Wave proved was not what its planners had intended. It proved that low-altitude mass heavy bomber strategic bombing against a defended target was not viable. The doctrine the Air War Plans Division had developed before the war, high-altitude precision bombing, refined eventually with long-range fighter escort in overwhelming numbers, was the only model that could actually deliver the strategic effects the planners wanted. The official Air Force history records the doctrinal verdict in a single sentence. The United States Army Air Forces never again attempted a low-level mission against German air defenses. The men who flew Tidal Wave did not die because the airplanes failed. They died because the plan was wrong. The mission was designed around assumptions about surprise and precision that the German integrated air defense system had already made obsolete. Smart, Brereton, Ent, the planners in Washington, the men who endorsed Tidal Wave at Trident, all of them were operating on a model of strategic bombing that the Luftwaffe had moved past. The 5 Medals of Honor were awarded not because the mission succeeded. They were awarded because the men who flew it executed an impossible order with a discipline and a courage that survived the failure of everything the planners had promised them. Baker held his formation in a burning aircraft because that was what the doctrine required. Gerstad volunteered for a tour he had already completed because the doctrine required someone to fly it. Hughes flew through a wall of flame because the doctrine required the target be hit. Johnson and Kane led their groups into burning refineries already filled with the debris of earlier attacks because the doctrine required the attempt to continue. The doctrine was wrong. The men were not. Operation Tidal Wave is remembered today by a small monument at Câmpina, by the recovered cockpit of Hadley's harem in Istanbul, and by the discovery, in April of 2022, of the remains of Lieutenant Colonel Addison Baker in a Romanian field. He was identified 79 years after he refused to leave formation in a burning aircraft. It is remembered by the largest single-day count of Medals of Honor awarded for any air action in the history of the United States, a record that, in 2026, still stands. What changed after Ploiesti was not the courage of the men who flew. It was the plan they were asked to fly. The 15th Air Force that returned to Ploiesti in April of 1944 did so because the men in Washington had finally learned what one afternoon over Romania had cost them to teach. The aircraft are in museums. The decisions still echo. This was Eagle Command. If you want to understand how America actually won the air war, not the legend, the record, subscribe to Eagle Command. New mission every week.